Hi, everybody. My name is Corey Fry, and I'm the exhibitions manager at the Delaplane Art Center. Thank you so much for being with us today for our Art at Noon series. We've really enjoyed having lots of guests from all over the place. We're doing some of our talks live in person, and some of these as webinars. We're recording all of them, and so if you know of any that you've missed, or if you hear today's talk and you know of anybody that would be interested but couldn't make it live, we'll be posting all of these talks. We have a backlog of lots of talks over the last 2 years on our YouTube channel, so you can check those out and send them to your friends and do all of the YouTube protocol that is required of us all. But there's lots of good content over there. I wanted to let you know too, if you're in the Frederick, Maryland area, or if you're traveling up here anytime soon during the summer or anything, we're open for business. We're open Monday through Saturday from 9 to 5, and on Sundays from 11 to 5. We've got lots of great exhibitions coming up, and we're working on installing some new exhibitions this next week. But July is our creative aging month here at the Delaplane, and so we have our annual Over 70 show that has, I think we're at about 120 different participants. It's going to be a great show. And then there's several other solo exhibitions. So come check things out. We've started up summer camps as well, and we've got fall classes, and we have summer classes opening up. We've got fall classes coming up. So you can, if you stop in, you can grab one of our magazines or go to our website and you can check out all the stuff that we have coming up, and all the talks that we have coming up as well. So the other thing I wanted to mention is, as we go on with the talk today, please feel free to submit questions. You can do that in the chat, or you can do it with the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll be paying close attention to those questions, and we'll have a time for Q&A at the end of Jennifer's talk today. But yeah, please send those through anytime, and we'll make sure that we hit all of them. Yeah, we'll be paying close attention there. So I'm so excited about today's talk. I've known about Jennifer Dasal for a while, and I've really enjoyed the ArtCurious podcast. And so I think it's going to be a great time. And I want to do a little intro of Jennifer before I just hand things over to her. But let me read a little bit about Jennifer's history here. So Jennifer Dasal is an art historian and is the creator and host of the ArtCurious podcast, an internationally popular bi-weekly show exposing the unexpected, the slightly odd, and the strangely wonderful in art history. It was chosen as one of PC Magazine's best podcasts of the year for 3 years in a row, from 2018 through 2020. And it was selected as one of the best history podcasts of 2019 by the Oprah magazine. In September 2020, Jennifer's first book, ArtCurious: Stories of the Unexpected, Slightly Odd, and Strangely Wonderful in Art History, was released by Penguin Books. The book has already received much coveted starred review from Publishers Weekly and highlighted in Book Page, Book List, and other publications. Dasal is the former curator of modern and contemporary art at the North Carolina Museum of Art, where she worked for 13 years. She received a BA in art history from the University of California, Davis, and her MA in art history from the University of Notre Dame. She's completed PhD coursework in art history at Pennsylvania State University. And prior to joining the North Carolina Museum of Art in 2008, she was the curatorial assistant to the curator of Western art at the Snite Museum, University of Notre Dame, Indiana, and at the Richard L. Nelson Art Gallery, University of California, Davis. She lives in Wendell, North Carolina with her husband, son, and her very grouchy cat. Jennifer, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. I'm really excited about your talk, and I'm just gonna let you go, let you loose.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Corey. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank everybody who's watching this, both in person right now as we're recording it, and then also hopefully a little bit later as well. So as Corey noted, I am the author of ArtCurious, the book, and also the host and creator of the ArtCurious podcast. And I like to joke that between my former full-time job at the North Carolina Museum of Art as a curator of modern art, I worked there, as Corey mentioned, for 13 years. And between everything else that I've been doing, speaking to you now, writing, doing all the research for a podcast, I like to joke that I say that I live, eat, and breathe art because it feels like I've made it my priority to be surrounded by it at every turn. And I like to share my story about how I got here because that story to me, I think, to quote the tagline of the podcast, is really unexpected and strangely wonderful in and of itself. Because if you had ever asked me growing up that I would thought that I would turn out to be an art historian and a curator, I think that I would have never, ever believed you. And that's really because I grew up thinking that art was pretty boring. And partially this really stemmed from this fact that I wasn't really exposed to the visual arts much as a child. Like I think there was the occasional school field trip, maybe twice throughout my entire non-college history, but that was probably it. It wasn't something that my family was particularly interested in. It's not like they didn't like going to museums. We just didn't really do it. And in terms of actually making art, any joy or interest that I felt around that concept was foiled by what felt like me to be an increasing number of very stern art teachers. And they made it feel like art making in any capacity was more like a chore, not something you could do to feel creative or to have any fun. And I always tell this one story that has stuck with me for, nigh on 30 years now. And hopefully you'll understand after you hear the story why it is so seared into my brain, because it truly had a long-term effect on my enjoyment of art for many, many years. When I was in junior high, I had an art teacher who came into our class, I would say probably every 2 weeks or so. So a couple times a month, she would come in and give an afternoon class. But she would begin every single visit with one exercise. And I call it the circle exercise. To this day, I have no concept of if this is a common exercise that art teachers use. Is it one that people used to do and don't do so much now? Is it just specific to this one teacher? I have no clue, but it basically went like this. She would put on like an old-fashioned egg timer, she would put 5 minutes on the clock, and then armed with only a pencil or a pen, we could erase if we wanted to, but we had those 5 minutes to draw a perfect circle freehand. And perfect was the key word. We had to draw as closely to making this ideal circle as possible. No rulers, no compass, no tools of any sort, with the exception of our hands and our writing implement. And again, we could erase, we could use a pencil, but that was it. And then we were graded on it, like an actual letter grade. We had to turn in our piece of paper at the end of every class. And I don't know if there are any perfectionists out there like me. I was and still am a perfectionist in recovery. And so I was there, in my front row, trying to get it done as closely as possible. And I failed every single time. It didn't matter how I held my paper or my pencil or how many times I erased. It just felt like creating the circle was something I could not crack. I hated it. And at best, when I got a letter grade, I received maybe a C+, and I remember that being amazing cause for celebration. And again, as somebody who wanted to get that A or that A+, that was really, really hard to deal with. So overall, I grew up thinking that that was what art was. That's how you made art. It was very strict. If you didn't reach that point of perfection, there was nothing for you there. So it felt like something that was totally inaccessible, something hard, something boring, something that had no place in my life whatsoever. And unfortunately, things actually didn't improve all that much as I got older. but they came to a really interesting breaking point when I was entering college. So I was registering for classes and I had all the requirements for my major that I declared very early, which was a science major. I was going to be a geologist, very randomly. And I was ready to go with everything like calculus and chemistry and, of course, earth science classes. But I needed some electives so I could check off that little pesky humanities requirement off of my graduation list. And everything that sounded really good to me, everything that I thought I would like a music class or writing or literature of any sort, all of that was completely maxed out and no teachers were accepting any more students. So I tried to register for probably about 5 or 6 courses before I just got so flustered that it seemed to me like nothing was available. And so I went and I made an appointment with a course counselor at my undergraduate. And I walked into her office. She sat down and said very calmly, "Don't worry, this happens all the time. We are going to register you into a course today, and it's going to be great." And I often have difficulty when I'm talking to younger students about this, but when I was in college, a while back now, they had actual physical books that were course catalogs, and UC Davis is a big school, so the book was like this thick. And she opened the first page to the letter A and started flipping through it, and almost immediately after that, she stopped and she said, "Oh, art history. Lots of people take art history classes. Let's just see if there's any opening in this kind of art history 101 course." And without me even opening my mouth, she had basically just jumped over to her computer and she registered me in this introduction to art history, ancient art to about Middle Ages, medieval art. And all of a sudden, there I was in an art history class for the first time. Now, given my history with art and art making in the past, how did I feel about this? I was not happy. I went into this class truly kicking and screaming, really dreading it. I wanted to do every single one of my other classes. That sounded way more fun to me. But then, of course, I always like to say the eternal joke is on me, because a couple of weeks in, I started realizing that I was starting to do something a little weird. And that was that while my roommates and my friends on their downtime were watching TV and reading, romance novels or the latest Stephen King or Dean Koontz book, as my reading material, I was starting to flip through my art history textbook. And that was really strange. I wanted to keep going. I wanted to see what was coming up next. I wanted to look at these images and kind of dig into them and peer closely at them and learn as much as I could about what was coming up in this course, because something had changed for me. I stopped looking at art as being dull or boring or unnecessary. And it truly came to life for me in really the first time in my life. And I was drawn into the stories, especially that I had great professors that they were telling us about these works of art, because they were stories about creation and inspiration and the urge to make art, which I think is something that marks us very fully as humans. And so fast forwarding 2 years later, I officially changed my major and I began studying art in earnest. The thing that I ended up eventually realizing was that my original point of view about art not being necessary or exciting or inviting or original, intriguing or worthy in any way, that feeling I've learned is not altogether uncommon. As I've progressed through life, I've essentially discovered that most people that I meet tend to fall on either side of a spectrum. And they're in these two camps. There's either the art lovers who have proclaimed their devotion to the visual arts, and the type of person on the other side who says, "I'm only at the museum today because my grandma made me come," or "I'm here just for the restaurant, which has awesome hamburgers," that kind of thing. And it seemed like there weren't many people kind of falling in that middle ground of the spectrum. And so I quickly learned that there were many people who felt about art the same way that I once felt about art. And I felt like my assumptions were kind of coming back to haunt me for revenge. But at the same time, I truly and uniquely felt like I could understand. And so as much as I love speaking to art lovers, even to this day, I also love speaking to people who I like to call kind of the art naysayers, the people who don't necessarily find a place for the visual arts in their lives. And I always thought, you know what, I can help you even just a little bit because I understand what you're like. I understand it because I've been there. And for me, the big thing was being able to have a good story be told about works of art. So I thought, well, maybe if I could find some kind of funny or funky or kind of weird stories about art, that always gets me excited about something. So I thought maybe I could just change people's minds even a little bit, do something that could inspire people, even in a small amount, to find out more about art or to discover something that might mean something more to them on a personal basis, a way that they could connect with art in a new way. And again, for me, what better way is there than to tell a story? You get to be entertained and then hopefully learn something along the way. And so that is when I first came up with the idea to do the ArtCurious podcast, which, as we've said at the top of our lecture here, it explores what I call the unexpected, the slightly odd, and the strangely wonderful in art history. I developed this show kind of briefly and quickly, and I premiered it in the summer of 2016. And part of the reason that I wanted to do a podcast, why I chose that as opposed to a blog or, Instagram account or anything like that, was that I feel and felt very strongly then and now that podcasts are a very democratic way to disseminate and enjoy stories. I personally love them. I call them adult story time. Now there are so many kids shows, which is also fun. So I can get my son involved in listening as well, because they are always most of the time they are free, though I know there's a lot of subscription models out there now. And so as long as you have access to a smartphone, a tablet, a computer, which obviously does negate some people being able to listen, but if you have access to those things, then you have access to podcasts very easily. And in 2016, so at that time, there were relatively few podcasts about art, let alone art history. In general, they were ones that were maybe interviews with artists or ones that were geared towards artists to learn methods to promote and to create further works. So as a big listener of podcasts myself, because I think of them as kind of like a daily, like the background to my life, I thought, well, that sounds fun. I love podcasts. Let's just see. It can't be that hard. Turns out that I was a little bit wrong on that last part. It takes a lot more work than I originally thought. So there was kind of a steep little learning curve there at the beginning. But here we are, and it's almost 6 years later. I would have never thought I would have kept this going for so long. And we still have an increasingly growing and steady listenership, an engaged listenership. And as of this moment, I am almost at episode 100 of full-length episodes, which are about 30 minutes in length. And then I do some deep dives, some interviews, and some bonus content. And I have covered a gamut, like a good gamut of art history. By no means have I covered everything, but I have done these dives into topics such as the theory that was put forward by the novelist Patricia Cornwell that perhaps a British painter named Walter Sickert could have been Jack the Ripper. I have also covered the stunning and successful career of one of my favorite artists, the official court portraitist to Marie Antoinette named Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun. I did a whole season about rivalries in art history, which was super exciting. And one of my favorites is this rivalry between the British painters John Constable and J.M.W. Turner, and the landscape paintings that got everybody in 19th century England just like completely riled up. And I've also covered the ways and reasons why people might destroy or attack works of art, why they would be art vandals. But there's one story that really holds a very special place in my heart, simply because it really brought me right here with you right now. It was the story that started it all. The actual impetus behind starting ArtCurious really started at one very specific time, and that was a business trip. I was on a plane, captive, sitting there as I was traveling to France to meet with an artist with whom I was working on a contemporary exhibition for the North Carolina Museum of Art. And he was based in the south of France, and I had a couple of days to kill transiting through Paris on my way. And I was thinking how nice it would be to be able to spend some time at the many amazing museums in Paris, because I am married and I have a little son who often travels with me. And so being able to spend as much time at an art museum as I would like doesn't often happen on family trips. So I thought, oh, it's going to be so great. I can spend as much time as I want at the Louvre. And the moment that I thought of the Louvre, the moment that popped in my head, I immediately jumped to, well, of course, then I can go see Mona Lisa, the most famous work of art potentially at the Louvre, and certainly one of the most famous works of art, period, most recognizable pieces. And every time I thought about the Mona Lisa, then and now, I think about this story that was told in that first year art history class that I was taking, in which my professor was talking about the Mona Lisa and why she's an important work of art. And at the end of her discussion, she said, and you can go see her. She's based at the Louvre in Paris. And then she paused. And in my imagination, it's like a very meaningful, deep 10-second pause. It was probably, 2 seconds, but she paused and she said, oh, but of course, if you don't make it to the Louvre, it's no big deal because the Mona Lisa that's on view there, totally fake. And I was floored. I thought that it was a joke and I sort of waited for her to laugh a little bit or say, just kidding, but she didn't. She went on for a second and basically said, oh, it was stolen in 1911 and it was gone for a couple of years. She explained it a little bit. I had never known any of this. I did not know that the Mona Lisa was stolen. I did not know that this work was potentially gone for a few years and maybe even stolen by forgers. There's this bizarre, crazy, twisty tale about this work of art. And my professor seemed very much to believe that in the process of that theft, potentially even a later theft, a second theft, that it was indeed forged and that the people involved returned or allowed the fake one, to be captured in some way. And that was what was returned to the Louvre. It was a crazy story. And the more that I thought about it while I was sitting on that plane on that business trip, I thought, you know what? I don't actually know much about the beats of that story of the theft. I'm going to look into it. And again, as I mentioned, the more you learn about this theft and the background to it, the more it is just like a Hollywood movie. It's completely bizarre. There are so many conspiracy theories, like my professor seemed to believe. And so I thought, if I, as an art historian, don't actually know a lot about this story, then a ton of people must not know about it. It is such a good story. I should tell it. Why not tell it in a podcast? I thought, how hard can it be to do a podcast? So it turns out that it looks really easy to do a podcast, but it certainly isn't. It takes a lot of time, especially for me. And I didn't know that going into it as someone who didn't have a lot of audio experience and certainly just a little bit of a recording background. So I'm kind of grateful in some ways that I didn't think really deeply about the technical side of it, but it does take me a lot of time in that I basically am writing what is the equivalent of a short-term paper every few weeks when I'm in season of the podcast. But I jumped in wholeheartedly and it's been something I've been doing for the past 6 years. And that first story, the first episode I released was indeed on the theft of the Mona Lisa. And of course, even now, it tends to be one of my most popular episodes, which is really fun. It's certainly one of my favorites and one that I mentioned has a very special place in my heart. And certainly when I began the show, I really went into it with very low expectations. I thought if 100 people listen to this episode and only half of them are related to me in some capacity, that's a major success. And that's when I really discovered that people like content. People love podcasts. People are interested in a vast variety of things, and even in art history. So I could not have known by any stretch of the imagination that the podcast would grow to how it has grown. It's mind blowing, and I'm completely humbled constantly that I've been featured on NPR a few times. It's been focused on in newspapers and magazines. It's been recommended online, not only locally here in North Carolina, but nationally and internationally in places like the Boston Globe, Parade Magazine, Salon, Arts and Antiques Weekly, and so many more. And as Corey mentioned, it was also chosen as one of the top 18 history podcasts by the Oprah Magazine. And also it has been named one of the best podcasts of the year by PC Magazine for 3 years in a row, which is shocking and wonderful because this is all very much a labor of love. I do not get rich doing this podcast. It is enough to currently sustain me, but art history is a very niche thing in many ways. And I am kind of a one-man band when it comes to creation and putting the show out into the world. So it's an independent show. I am not supported by a large organization or a podcast company. So it has been this incredible new world that's opened up to me over the last few years. And I would say that one of the biggest things that it's brought me, of course, is the opportunity to write my first book. I guess my first non-exhibition catalog book. I did a couple publications for the museum, but this is a totally separate beast. So this came out officially in September of 2020 in physical book form, but also in audiobook and ebook form. And if you had asked me or had suggested to me that a book was a thing that would be in my future, just like with being called a curator and an art historian, I would have thought, no way. And to be fair, I was not at all interested in writing this book. It was not even on my agenda or my horizon. And several years ago, after the podcast had been going for, I would say maybe about a year and a half or 2 years at that point, my husband sat me down and he said, now what? What's next? And I said, more podcast episodes. And he said, okay, well, yeah, that's good. But you've written all of this stuff. You've done all of the research. You have the material. What are you going to do with it? I think you should write a book. And I said, I don't think so. So it was really him who tried to push me in that direction. But for me, it felt like kind of like an impossibility because in some ways, I think of writers as magical people, fancy people, not normal people like me who have lives and responsibilities and families. It just seemed like something that happened to people in movies. And so I basically told him, thanks, but no thanks. I'm not doing it. And then he wore me down. I have to say he was very loving and gentle about it, but he kept coming to me, every couple of weeks and saying, have you thought more about doing this? Just think on it. And finally, one day I caved and I sat down and I started writing a book proposal. The main goal of writing ArtCurious as a book is really similar to the main goal of doing the podcast, which is that I wanted to reiterate that stories about art have a place in our world, and that also focusing sometimes on the funnier or the stranger or the slightly offbeat tales about art and about anything really is a fun way to allow an art newbie or someone who's not really into the art world to find their footing in that place. Because as many of us know, the art world is not always the most inclusive and welcoming place. And if you don't have a lot of art experience, like me growing up, it can be scary to enter that place. And it's also scary to feel like you don't know what to do. You don't know how to think. You don't even know necessarily how to look at a work of art. So if you can talk about these stories in an interesting way, that might excite people a little bit and get them to want to transform into museum goers or collectors, even burgeoning art historians. That's all the better. For me, that's gravy. But if I can just spend 30 minutes in your ear telling you something fun or interesting, for me, that is all that I wanted, is just to share these cool stories. And so I'm happy that Penguin Books felt the same way. And so they felt that there was space in the world for these tales about ArtCurious and art history. So I want to spend a couple of minutes sharing some of my favorite stories from the book. So you can get this in ArtCurious, Stories of the Unexpected, Slightly Odd, and Strangely Wonderful in Art History. I'm not going to go into all the details, of course, because you just want to give you a little taste of what's in the book. If you haven't already read it, I love all of the stories that I included in ArtCurious. They're kind of like my little art children, but here are 3 of my favorites. So the first one involves probably one of the most famous and favorite artists around the world, which is Vincent Van Gogh. And so when you think about Van Gogh, you think sometimes of this epitome of the depressed, miserable, artistic genius. But there is a story that many people believe, and I think in the last few years, it really actually has been growing in credibility, which is that Van Gogh did not commit suicide, but that he was killed either accidentally or on purpose in July of 1890. So we know that Van Gogh did suffer from mental illness, and he did have himself committed to a mental asylum in the year prior to his death. And during that time, doctors reported that he did try to kill himself. So it doesn't seem like a stretch to me to think that he would assume or would try to do it again. He did note that during his death or in the process of him wounding himself, he went into a wheat field and apparently shot himself in the stomach before returning back to the inn that he was staying at in Auvers-sur-Oise outside of Paris. And he lived for another 2 days before he succumbed to his injuries. And it was there in those 2 days that he told his doctors, the innkeeper, even his brother who came to sit at his bedside, that he wanted to be very clear that he was himself the one who killed him or injured himself. And he said to them to, quote, not blame anyone else. And it felt like that was a very odd statement. Very much the eyewitnesses to this decline and to his death said that they thought that was a weird thing for someone to say. And then it was a statement that was made even odder going through time because there were these little strange occurrences, like the fact that all of Van Gogh's art equipment from that day that he was painting in the field disappeared, as well as the disappearance of the gun that was apparently used in the shooting. And also that several eyewitnesses mentioned that no one ever referred to this event as anything other than an accident. So it was not seen as being purposeful, even when Van Gogh said, I did this to myself. And then several other eyewitnesses showed up that mentioned that during Van Gogh's final days, they had noticed that there was this heightened animosity between Vincent, and he had a rather poisonous relationship with this. Yeah, I love this. Every time this kind of blows my mind. With a teenage boy with a Wild West obsession, who had a very mean kind of bullying temperament, and who owned potentially a malfunctioning revolver. So it's a very interesting theory. It's not mine. I didn't make it up. Some incredible biographers came up with this and included it in none other than the notes of their book. So the end notes. It wasn't even something they covered in their main biography. It's kind of amazing. My second favorite story from ArtCurious involves this long-held debate about who was the first totally abstract artist. Art historians love to do this. We love to categorize everything and build the timeline and say, this person was first at this. In other words, people were really looking, and art historians wanted to find that first painter or artist in general who created a completely non-representational work of art. So art for art's sake, art that's not presenting what a cow looks like, but it could be just color, shape, tone, so forth. And a lot of art historians throughout time have really pinned this first on the Russian painter Vasily Kandinsky as the man who came forward with doing this remarkable feat around 1911, 1913 with this painting that you can see here on your screen. If I can get my keyboard to go forward. This is a detail of his painting, which is called Composition 3, I believe, or 4. And even Kandinsky, during his lifetime, about 2 decades after he created this work of art, really tried to grab that title of first abstract artist for himself. And in the 1930s, he wrote to his art dealer saying, it really is the very first abstract painting in the world, because in those days, there was no other artist who painted abstract pictures. Therefore, it is an historic painting, unquote. But so one of the best things about art history for me, especially in the last few decades, is that we have this opportunity to continually reassess artists and works of art, especially artists who, for many different reasons, have fallen by the wayside in art history. So mostly, as I know you can imagine, or that you've seen in art museums and art centers personally, is that there has been more of an interest in getting diverse artists out there and getting diverse artists' works out there. So a lot of non-white males. So there's artists of color, women, various gender and sexual identities, and so on. And 2 women who recently in the past years who have come into the spotlight are the British painter Georgiana Houghton, who you see here, and then also the Swedish painter Hilma af Klint. And if you recognize that name, it's because she especially has kind of hit it big in the last 5 years, because there was an awesome blockbuster exhibition of her work a few years ago at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. So here's a screenshot of one of the galleries that was on that part of that exhibition. And what's really interesting about both of these artists is that though they were very much not really known outside of local art circles during their lifetimes, and these women, by the way, did not know each other, it seems like both of them created what we would potentially now identify as abstract art years, and in the case of Georgiana Houghton, even decades before Kandinsky did. So this is a fascinating story. It's one that allows us to reconsider the traditional ways that we tell stories about art and art history. And then what's even more fascinating is that both of these women, again, very much independently of each other, they did not know one another or were familiar with one another's works, but both of them were involved in the spiritualist movement of the late 19th and kind of early 20th centuries. And both of them claimed that there was some supernatural assistance at work in their canvases. So that one is one of my favorites. Definitely get the book if you haven't already to read the whole story, because it is, again, stranger than fiction in many ways and very, very fun. And then finally, the third tale that I want to give you a little teaser on is this one. So I mentioned that I love listening to podcasts. I listen to a lot of NPR shows as well, also in their podcast form. And a few years ago, I was listening to an episode of This American Life, and I heard a story about a group of people who were working on this incredibly huge and really cool sounding project, which is that they spent their time opening, cataloging, and preserving over 600 time capsules. And who doesn't listen to that job description and say, that is such a random and awesome job. I want to open, time capsules for a living. That sounds great. But then the reporter mentioned who the creator and previous owner of these capsules were. And I was floored because I didn't know this. And again, I was kind of embarrassed that I didn't know this, but the creator was none other than Andy Warhol, who is really, probably one of the biggest names next to Picasso when it comes to 20th century art. One of the most important artists of the last centuries for sure. But we know that Warhol was a very prolific collector, and he amassed these incredible just junk piles in many ways of everything from movie star memorabilia when he was a child to all kinds of specific dishware and ceramics. What you're seeing now is that he had a very incredible kitschy cookie jar collection in his house. And after he died, there was a massive sale of his estate. And in the process of sorting through all of his items and kind of determining what could be sold or salvaged, this, by the way, is a picture of his living room in his apartment after his death. People realized that it was just full of masses of stuff. And among all that stuff there were these hundreds of boxes in his home and also in a storage facility and also in his studio. And they were essentially archives of his life. Some of these boxes, he referred to them specifically under the title Time Capsules. Some of these boxes were made in a very particular month. So like say December 1976. But then there were ones that were based on specific themes. Like one of my favorites that I learned about is that he had a box that was dedicated specifically to the flights that he took on the Concorde supersonic jet. And then the one that you see here on this screen on the right side is his Miss Piggy box. So it's all of his like Miss Piggy, Jim Henson, Sesame Street, Muppets, stuff that he had, which is really kind of interesting as well. But then what I think is so weird and wonderful about these time capsules is that he not only kept things that you would think of as being important in some way, at least to you and me, like pictures of his friends, letters, sketches or notes for, preparatory studies for works of art that he would go on to create. But then he also kept things that at least I would definitely want to raise my eyebrows or question the need to include. Like he kept shoes that had once been worn by Clark Gable. He kept toenail clippings, junk mail, and even a piece of what was rumored to be Caroline Kennedy's sweet 16th birthday cake. So moldy food was definitely apparently an integral part of the time capsules. But then when you get to the bottom of all of this, I think it's really interesting because these capsules not only act as this huge, large scale diary entry for just the minutia of Andy Warhol's life, but that we can also peer in and understand the kind of things that inspired and motivated and surrounded him. And because of that, they could also be seen as a biography to the artist, and also, when taken together, as a large-scale art installation, and really the most personal kind of art installation that there ever could be. And when you take that into conjunction with his works of art, his paintings and his prints especially, it truly rounds out both his biography and his artistic career in a way that it truly would have been impossible to understand if it were not for the reality of these time capsules. And you can see some of these. They usually are in storage, but occasionally one is typically on view at the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So if you ever get the chance to go there, you can see at least one of them kind of broken down in person, so you can see all the tidbits that are included therein. So all of this, I hope, has brought you some of those kind of non-traditional tales of art history to life for you. And my goal, as I mentioned, is always just to hopefully crack open a new world to my listeners, at least in some small way, because mixing things up and not sometimes following the rules of the generally prescribed notions of how art should be read or understood or discussed, I've noticed even in my own life, can really make a huge difference in allowing a work of art to be understood by new generations, new communities. Unconventionality can go a long way to sharing a field that, as I mentioned, can sometimes feel really exclusionary or exclusive. Very rightly so, the arts have long been considered that. So that's the mode of thinking that I try to put through generally in ArtCurious as a whole. Using this different framework, a kind of storytelling approach, sometimes a mixing and matching approach that allows us to push back against the boundaries that have long been set in this very strict and strictured field. And so I think a lot of those small tactics can make a difference, because if I share some details about this work of art by Georgia O'Keeffe, which is called Jimson Weed White Flower #1, but I talked to you first about how it broke records as the most expensive work ever sold at auction by a female artist, then that story and that little bit of information, that might be an in for someone who is into the financial side of things, but might not typically want to learn about visual arts per se. So sometimes that's all it takes in my mind. It's just a little changing up of the narrative and sharing something unexpected, slightly odd, and strangely wonderful. And again, as I mentioned, if people are learning something along the way, that is just gravy. So hopefully you've learned a little bit about how I've done this whole thing. It's been really exciting to be able to share my art historical adventure with you today. So thank you all for joining me. And I hope at the very least I've made your world a little bit curious today. So thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen, and I would love it if anybody has any questions. I would love to answer whatever I can.
Thank you, Jennifer, so much.
Thank you, Corey.
Really, really interesting. I love, I love the way that your perspective opens a world that may be familiar to some in a new light. It's super interesting. But please submit questions if you have any. You can do that in the chat or with the Q&A button at the bottom. As we wait to see if any questions come through, I've got a few that I'm interested in. I mean, you touched on this quite a bit, Jennifer, but I think one of the powerful things about this is the way that it sort of rehumanizes not just art history, but what it means to be an artist. Like we sort of isolate what we understand artists to be based off of a work in a particular kind of room, right? In like a gallery space. But this opens up the possibility of sort of recomplexifying, if that's a word, reintroducing complexity into what it means to be an artist. And I think in that way, it actually gives more people permission to explore on the level of being curious about art history, but also being curious about themselves and not thinking that there need to be very strict rules around what it means to be an artist. But yeah, I wonder if I don't know. Do you have any thoughts of that? That's not about that. That's not really a question at all.
No, but I love that. And I don't know that I consciously think about that very often. But then I think about the feedback that I receive from listeners. And I have a large listenership of artists who tell me that they're listening when they're sketching or when they're creating works in the studio. And so that they find some inspiration or just that nudge to be creative. And I think that is awesome because you're right. There aren't rules. Like a lot of people will tell you that there are rules, but I'm firmly in the camp of believing that everyone can be an artist. Everybody can try something out. Just like I firmly believe that there is a work of art out there that is, your work of art to inspire you. Yeah. I like to give people as much permission to like something or dislike something. I think that's okay too. That's something that I think as a curator of contemporary art for the last few years, that's something that I often see people struggling with. There are all kinds of barriers to enjoying art and to wanting to create art. And so if there's anything that I can do, even telling you it's okay to think this is an ugly painting, or it's okay not to like something, and it's okay to not do what your art teacher says, that's okay too. I just want to break down as much of that as possible because art is for everyone. Art is part of our humanity, the urge to create something, whether it be to just express a feeling or a thought or an emotion, or, to represent what your mom looks like at any given age. They're to create something beautiful. That's one of the defining things of our humanity, I think.
That's so great. Yeah.
I'm glad you feel that way.
Yes, totally. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, it's like we normalize everything through the structures that we understand them through. But this opens up the fact that we're all pretty weird. Like we're all pretty strange.
Yeah.
And so it just opens that up for everyone.
Agree.
So there's this isn't a question, but it's from one of our listeners and viewers, Richard Hoff. Richard's the one that I was mentioning to you earlier. Richard has a solo exhibition here at the Delaplane right now, but he says, "Hi, Jennifer. I bought your book when it first came out. I enjoyed it very much." And he mentions, the McNeese University show. He said, also, thank you for awarding me a purchase award at the McNeese University. His drawing was called No, No, No. It sounds like so.
I like this piece a lot. And thank you, Richard, for being here today. Thank you for buying the book. Thank you for your kind words. Definitely anybody who can check out Richard's work. It is really cool. I loved jurying him into this exhibition that I did at the McNeese State University. Goodness, March, maybe? Feels like forever ago, but it was just yesterday, it feels like also. I was telling Corey before we jumped on to start the webinar that's one of the things I really, really, really love as an art historian and a curator is when I get the opportunity to visit new towns, to jury in exhibitions, to hold or even curate my own shows, is because I get to be surrounded by incredible artists from around the country, and I see something new and inspiring every single time. I am consistently blown away by what people are able to make and create. And I never get tired of it. The hardest part is that I can't ever accept everybody, which I always want to do, but it is so much fun. We are very blessed to have so many creative people just all around us at any given time. It is awesome.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I wanted to ask if the way, trying to think of how to ask this, has your research and what you've done for the podcast sort of shaped, maybe you've touched on this a little bit, but shaped the way that you think about our current world, but also our current art world, and ways that you can even open things up in a broader way for people that I know the podcast is doing that work, but I'm curious if you have like suggestions even for ways that people can handle art history in a way that would make it more accessible to people. Does that question make sense?
I think so. The first thing that comes to my mind is thinking a lot about when COVID hit in March 2020 and so much of our world turned digital, and that art centers and art museums, we all had to scramble because in a lot of cases we had to shut down completely. So the North Carolina Museum of Art, where I was at, we didn't have anybody in our building for more than 6 months, I believe, may have been 9 months. And so that's really hard when you can't go physically to a space and see an exhibition, whether it be at a major museum or your local art gallery. That can be rough because that personal one-on-one relationship or understanding of a work of art is so integral, I think, to being able to feel something when you see it. It's not the same when you look on a computer screen. So at the same time, I think that was a challenge for people like me and others working in museums and galleries and centers to think of other ways to share and understand art. Sometimes it's through webinars like this, but sometimes it's like taking an image and making a Spotify playlist around it or translating it into a coloring book, like things that I think 5 or 10 years ago, art museums and even artists would be like, that is not what I wanted. It feels like it's cheapening it in some way, that it's not high on the pedestal of an art museum. And then instead I'm like, here's a freebie of a PDF I made. But I don't feel that way. I feel like it totally opens up the world. So using any tools that you can to disrupt the traditional ways that we've been looking at art and art history, I think can only really help in many ways. It can sometimes feel alienating, I think, to the old school, old guard people who just want to see art in one particular way. But, they still can. You can still go into an art museum and have that traditional, I'm going to sit on a bench and look at a painting for a few minutes thing. But also, I don't know. I like that things like Google Arts and Culture are out there so that you can spend your time on your computer at home, zooming in so you can see those brushstrokes as much as possible. Yeah. It's cool. There's just options out there. I don't know that I answered your question properly, but that's what
I think it's great. No, I think that's fantastic. Yeah, I think that's great. I wanted to ask you about your research. Maybe your method of research, like if you get wind of an interesting topic that you want to dive deep into, what's your process like? Like where do you decide to start, and how in depth can that go before it's like this has gone too far? I'm just curious about your process.
That is such a good question too. I feel like I'm dealing with that right now, where it's like, here are my confines. In general, when it comes to the podcast, I have like 30 to 40 minutes that I'm looking to fill. And I've narrowed that down to about 10 to 12 pages of writing, double spaced. So it's easy now, and then I have that physical stopping point. But otherwise, I'm a completist. And I think that's hard for art historians in general, or historians in general, where you want to say, this is a comprehensive history of this entire person's work, or this entire background of the work of art. So I have to stop sometimes, and I literally will out loud tell myself, you're in the weeds, get out of the weeds. It's like, I have to remember, I'm not writing my dissertation. I am writing something for a general audience, and I want to give them background. I want to give them the occasional art term, but I don't want to alienate anyone or hopefully not bore people too much. So I do have to limit it. I would say when I first hear something, depending on how weird or how interesting it is, I will spend some time Googling around to make sure it's not like fake news. Sure. Art history's version of fake news. But yeah, I usually really start by digging into what's out there online, books that are already written, any articles that are already written. I try to get as up to date when it comes to materials as possible. And I have a really lucky situation in that I live in Raleigh, North Carolina. As we mentioned, I used to work at the North Carolina Museum of Art, which is based in Raleigh, and they have a wonderful and very in-depth art library. So I have art librarians who can help me source articles if I need them, and also public libraries also do the same amazing things. But I've got there at my fingertips all kinds of books, journals, exhibition catalogs, and that is a huge, huge boon for me. So really, it's just a lot of reading.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. I wanted to ask you too about, is it uncomfortable at all to deal with a lack of resolve? I guess the reason why I'm asking this is like, with the story of Van Gogh, for instance, or the story of the Mona Lisa, like there aren't clear-cut answers to it. And the idea about sort of enveloping yourself in curiosity is dealing with the fact that there aren't easy answers to any of these things, but we kind of live in a world where that in some ways, like it demands resolve. Like you want the story to resolve, you want the song to resolve in certain ways. Is that challenging at all, or does it just feel super hopeful, like that things could go any direction at any time?
Ooh, that's such a good question. I feel like I live in both at the same time. Like I'm hopeful. I really hope that in those circumstances, I can give you permission to come up with your own thoughts and own theories. And you could be like, I totally believe Mona Lisa is fake. And the next person would be like, no way, that is totally the real painting. And that both are valid and equal and fair. So that's something that I hope listeners and readers will do. At the same time, I completely know that there are moments where I feel like it's a cop-out. So I feel very torn in that sometimes I'm like, did the Baroness Elsa von Freytag actually make this work that has long been a Marcel Duchamp masterpiece?
Yeah.
I can't say for sure. We don't have proof. I want to give you what I have. I want to give you as much information, but it's hard when I can't say like, I have the definitive answer, because I'm with you. I want the definitive answer. We all, I think, do. So yeah, it's uncomfortable and it does feel like a cop out, but it is what it is, I think, in many ways.
Totally. And I love the idea of leaving things open-ended for people to make their own decisions about. That's fantastic.
Sometimes I give my opinion, like spoiler alert for the Jack the Ripper episodes I did 6 years ago. Do I think Walter Sickert was Jack the Ripper? No, but at the same time, there is some weird coincidences and similarities. I'm going to kind of keep a very skeptical eye on that story, but I'm not out there like Patricia Cornwell is. And I'm not saying like, everyone, guess what? We totally know it was Jack the Ripper. It was this painter. I do put myself out there sometimes with my opinion, but I also don't want people to feel like that is the opinion, because I believe everybody can have their own thoughts. And again, they're totally allowed to do that.
Yeah. Well, that's great, Jennifer. I'm out of questions. It looks like we've got all the questions answered that have come through. Thank you so much for your time today. It was really thoughtful and just thorough and just a good, I think a great introduction to what you do. So I really hope that people dive in a bit more to what you're doing. And I know that I'm going to be listening to some more of the podcast as well. We just had something else come through from, looks like her name is Trini Jones. She says, thank you. I'm a new listener to the podcast. My son has listened at times with me. He took an art class his freshman year, and next year he's taking AP art history. He told his teacher about the podcast, and I told him that she probably knows about it. The teacher probably knows about it. So yeah.
That honestly means so much to me. I have to say, especially in moments where it's like it feels like a slog doing the podcast, all the editing, all the writing and the research and the revising. And then I get a nice comment like that somebody says, I like this episode. I like this show. It means the world. So thank you so much. And thank you to your son for listening and also awesome for taking AP art history. I feel like it's very rare that people get the chance to take art history, let alone in high school. So that is such a cool thing. And so bravo for him for sure.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Jennifer, thank you again. Really appreciate your time. Thank you for doing this. I'm excited about what's ahead for you. Man, you should totally do like a curated exhibition about weird stories, like artwork that's curated around some of the weird stories that you've done.
That would be so fun. I would love that.
I don't know how you'd curate anything that has the Mona Lisa. Maybe you could get your hands on a fake version. Possibly.
There you go. Yeah. The real fake. Oh, yeah. That's awesome. That's a fun idea. I like it.
No, but thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure. It was a great time for me too.
Good. Well, thank you all for being here. Like I said before, check out our YouTube channel for previous conversations that we've had and guests that we've had. Go to our website as well. Check out upcoming exhibitions and programs and classes. We appreciate you being here and watching, and we hope that you all have a good Friday and a good weekend. So bye, everybody.